In Surrey, England, sits the Oxted Estate, a large tract of private land owned by a company called Bocardo. Immediately adjacent to this estate is a small, heavily industrialized parcel of land known as the Coney Hill Wellhead. The geography here is critical because of what lies deep underground. Beneath this region sits the Palmer's Wood oil field, a naturally occurring reservoir of petroleum. Crucially, the most lucrative section of this reservoir, the apex where the oil concentrates, lies directly beneath Bocardo's Oxted estate, not under the Coney Hill wellhead. This pumpjack captures the industrial reality of the extraction process. To maximize their yield, the operators of the Coney Hill site, Star Energy, drilled 3 distinct production wells, designated PW5, PW8, and PW9. But they did not drill straight down, they drilled diagonally. This 3D volumetric cross-section illustrates the physical intrusion. Star Energy deviated their pipelines across the property boundary, penetrating the geological strata beneath the Oxted estate at depths between 800 and 2,900 feet below the surface. They did this to tap the apex of the oil field. At no point did they seek permission or negotiate a way-leave agreement with Bocardo to enter the subsurface of the estate. When Bocardo discovered the pipelines years later, they sued for trespass. They argued that because the pipes were sitting on their property, they were entitled to a percentage of the gross revenue for all the oil extracted through them. Based on a 9% royalty calculation, the trial judge initially awarded Bocardo over £600,000 in damages. Star Energy appealed, and the case ultimately reached the Supreme Court. The final ruling delivered a specific outcome. Bocardo won the trespass claim, proving Star Energy had violated their property rights. Yet the financial award was slashed from over £600,000 to a mere £1,000. A £1,000 verdict for decades of unauthorized oil extraction requires a complete deconstruction of how English law models 3-dimensional property boundaries. Furthermore, it exposes the precise mechanisms by which statutory frameworks neutralize the economic leverage of private landowners. To understand the trespass, we have to define the vertical limits of land ownership. English law historically relied on an ancient Latin maxim, Cuius est solum, eius est usque ad coelum et ad inferos. This image of an ancient underground tunnel establishes the historical context for that rule. For centuries, subsurface property disputes only dealt with shallow subterranean works, like catacombs or cellars. The down-to-hell concept was largely theoretical, because physical labor strictly limited how deep humans could go. The 20th century broke the up-to-heaven aspect of the maxim. In the case of Bernstein v. Skyviews, the courts restricted vertical airspace rights to a height necessary for the ordinary use and enjoyment of the land, preventing landowners from suing passing aircraft for trespass. Star Energy built their defense by applying that airspace logic downward. They argued property rights should only extend as deep as a landowner can reasonably use. Since pipelines at 2,800 feet deep didn't interfere with Bocardo's enjoyment of the surface one iota, Star Energy claimed no trespass had occurred. The UK Supreme Court, seen here, rejected Star Energy's defense. The justices refused to mirror the airspace restriction for the deep earth. They ruled that while airspace is a public highway out of physical necessity, the solid strata below the surface is not. As a general rule, anything that can be touched or worked belongs to someone. This diagram tracks the court's vertical property model. The justices established a new boundary, declaring that ownership extends straight down until it reaches the point of absurdity. This is the depth at which extreme geological pressure, around 50,000 pounds per square inch, and temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit render the concept of human ownership physically meaningless. Because 2,800 feet is well above this point of absurdity, the strata firmly belonged to Bocardo. By drilling through it without permission, Star Energy committed an unauthorized physical intrusion. Trespass is actionable per se under English law, meaning a landowner does not need to prove physical damage or loss to win the claim. Star Energy was unequivocally liable. The legal battle then shifted entirely away from the physical dirt and onto the calculation of damages. Inside this courtroom, the debate shifted to how you compensate a landowner for a harmless trespass. The baseline legal standard is the way-leave basis. A way-leave assessment asks the court to determine a hypothetical price. They must calculate what a willing grantor, the landowner, and a willing grantee, the oil company, would have agreed upon in a fair negotiation for the right to lay those pipes. Bocardo approached this hypothetical negotiation by arguing that their land possessed a unique ransom value. They contended that because their strata provided the only efficient path to the reservoir's apex, they held total control over access to the resource. In a standard commercial negotiation, this kind of geographic exclusivity provides immense leverage. Bocardo used this logic to justify demanding a 9% share of the total petroleum revenue, the six-figure claim, rather than a flat nominal access fee. This flowchart maps the legal reality of UK petroleum extraction, which introduces a massive statutory hurdle. Under the Petroleum Production Act 1934, Parliament stripped private landowners of subsurface mineral rights. Section 1 of the Act vested all property rights to naturally occurring petroleum exclusively in the Crown. The Crown then issues extraction licenses. Star Energy holds the license to drill, and in exchange, they pay royalties directly to the Crown. Bocardo owns the rock, but they have zero legal claim to the oil passing through it. This creates the central tension of the case. Bocardo owns the physical route to the resource, but they do not own the resource itself. The Supreme Court had to decide if geographic positioning alone grants a private landowner the legal right to demand a cut of a nationalized asset. The answer lies in the Mines, Working Facilities and Support Act 1966. This statute gives an oil licensee a specific power. If a landowner refuses access or demands an exorbitant price, the oil company can ask the court to compulsorily acquire the necessary ancillary rights, like a wayleaf. Because Star Energy had the statutory power to force an acquisition, the Supreme Court ruled that the compensation must be calculated using standard compulsory purchase principles. The most important of these is the point-gourd rule, which mandates that compensation for a forced acquisition cannot include any increase in land value created entirely by the underlying statutory scheme itself. This comparative model demonstrates the rule in action. On the left, we see the market value of the Oxted Estate's deep substrata before the 1934 Petroleum Act was passed. Because private companies had no legal mechanism to extract deep oil on a national scale, the market value of a transit route 2,800 feet underground was effectively zero. Any economic leverage Bocardo claimed was a direct result of the right side of the model. The value of their geographic position was not intrinsic to the land, it was a value created by the Crown's national extraction scheme. Applying the point-gourd rule means the hypothetical negotiation must take place in a no-scheme world. By legally erasing the Crown's extraction scheme from the valuation, the court stripped Bocardo of their ability to negotiate for a share of the profits. The court instead looked at the standard rates for deep tunnels, which were as low as £50 per acre. Even adding the statutory 10% uplift for the forced nature of the acquisition, the calculated compensation totaled less than £100. The Court of Appeal ultimately awarded a global sum of £1,000, a figure described as generous given that Bocardo suffered no physical damage or loss of amenity. This global award of £1,000 effectively covered both the past and continuing trespass. By isolating the dirt's value from the value of the national resource, the court ensured that compensation was based strictly on what the landowner lost, rather than what the oil company gained. Returning to our 3D cross-section, the Supreme Court's ruling reconciles the initial paradox. The judgment maintains the vertical integrity of property boundaries, but precludes private landowners from leveraging them against national infrastructure. Bocardo owns the rock, but cannot interfere with statutory rights of extraction. This legal framework extends far beyond oil. The Bocardo v. Star Energy precedent provides the exact legal blueprint that will govern emerging deep earth technologies requiring subsurface transit beneath private land. As we see in this simulation, industries like deep geothermal heat mining and carbon capture networks will inevitably require subterranean infrastructure crossing beneath private estates. The Supreme Court has drawn the map for this future infrastructure. Under English law, you own the rock deep beneath your feet to the point of absurdity, but you cannot weaponize that ownership to extract the value of national projects passing through it.